My name is Margot French, and I grew up near the intersection of St. Clair and Jane Street. Now, the stockyards were a defining factor in our day-to-day lives, mostly because, well, the stockyards smelt. And most of the people in the neighborhood either worked at the stockyards, worked for the packers, Swifts or Maple Leaf Packers, a few other private abattoirs, and the stockyards themselves, which were the holding pens and the were actually where they would have the people bid on the animals that were going to wherever they were going. And that was over at Keel Street and St. Clair. The stockyards were a particular factor because when you're young and growing up near the stockyards, when they talk about street proofing in today's age and not talking to strangers, ours were really to deal with the steer. They had a sacrificial steer that would lead the cows over across the street, across St. Clair, to one of the two major packers. And eventually, one of them would wander off. They were usually the big steers with the large horns, but it was very impressive with the horns especially. So we were taught that if you happened to be in the schoolyard, which Georgetown School was at the end of the street, and if you're in the schoolyard, which I was once, the bull came in, it would be wandering around. It had no idea where it's going, but you were taught you must not run. You cannot outrun a bull. You cannot climb the chain link fence, and you just get near the wall and stand still and don't look it in the eye. They're big animals, and I wasn't terrified. And it eventually wanders off, and eventually they would wander down to Jane and St. Clair. But at that point, somebody would show up with a gun and shoot it. And it was a standard practice. We'd all gather around to see the bull shot. I have a vague idea that somebody tried to lasso the thing, but of course they didn't know how to lasso. And it was easier just to shoot it and drag it back to stockyards. I don't know if it was eaten. I never asked those questions. And I suppose that was a livestock introduction to where our food came from. But the stockyards were important. I did have a cousin once which had a good story. She was working evening shift, and she hadn't really noticed. She parked underneath where the abattoir would take carcasses across to the across from where they were slaughtered to where they were being packaged and cut up. And she got off at midnight, so it was quite dark. And she got in her car and she was driving down St. Clair over to the other side of Jane, and the police stopped her. And she said, well, she knew she wasn't, going fast. She was just going home from work. And they asked her, where did she work? And she said she was working at Maple Leaf. And they said, are you aware that your car is covered in blood? And she had no idea, but there must have been a leak. And where her car was, over the course of her 8-hour shift, it got covered in blood. Okay, little things like that happen because when you're near the stockyards, you knew that there was always going to be some dead animal around or things, and that was part of growing up in the neighborhood.